June 16, 1943. Somewhere over Bougainville, Solomon Islands, 25,000 feet. A fireball erupts in the sky. Not from a bomb, not from a missile, from a Japanese Zero that flew directly into the nose of an American bomber and lost. The explosion is so violent that debris rains down for 30 seconds. The crew doesn't celebrate. They don't have time. Because 17 more Zeros are climbing toward them. Fast. One bomber. 17 fighters. No escort. No backup. No way home. And the pilot is bleeding to death. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we dive deeper into the story's historical events and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe that the most extraordinary stories are the ones history forgot to tell loudly. We're glad you're here. This is the story of Captain J. Zemer, a man the United States Army Air Force considered a problem, a loose cannon, an insomniac with an attitude and no crew willing to fly with him. He was handed a bomber that mechanics refused to touch, serial number 412666A machine, parked in a graveyard of broken planes that everyone agreed was beyond saving. On June 16, 1943, Zemer and his crew of misfits flew that dead plane solo over the most heavily defended island in the Pacific. They faced 17 Japanese Zero fighters. They stayed in the fight for 40 minutes. They completed the mission. They brought home photographs that saved thousands of American lives during the invasion of Bougainville. And 2 men on that plane received the Medal of Honor. By the time you finish this story, you will understand that the most dangerous weapon in the history of World War II was not a tank, not a bomb, not a Zero fighter. It was a pilot who couldn't sleep and refused to be told what was impossible. But to understand what Zemer did, you first have to understand the world he was flying into. In the spring of 1943, the Pacific War had hit a wall. The American strategy was to push North Island by island until bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. But sitting directly in the path of that advance was Bougainville, a volcanic island covered in jungle and ringed with military infrastructure so dense it resembled a floating fortress. The Japanese had carved airfields into the coastline. They had positioned anti-aircraft artillery in overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach. They had stationed hundreds of Zero fighters, the Mitsubishi A6MA machine, that was fast, agile, and lethal, in the hands of pilots who had been flying combat since the attack on Pearl Harbor. American commanders knew that sending an invasion force toward Bougainville without precise intelligence was a death sentence. They needed maps. Specifically, they needed high-resolution aerial photographs of the coastlines, the reef systems, the hidden gun placements, and the airfield locations. Without those photographs, the Marine landing craft would be driving blind into prepared defenses. The casualty numbers would be catastrophic. The problem was that getting those photographs required something that seemed operationally impossible. A plane would have to fly over the island in broad daylight alone at altitude, holding perfectly straight and level for 20 uninterrupted minutes, while the cameras in the belly clicked through their sequence. A formation of bombers would be too slow and too visible. A fighter didn't carry the cameras or the fuel. It had to be a heavy bomber, a B-17 flying solo in daylight over an island defended by one of the most aggressive fighter squadrons in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The mission profile circulated through the squadrons. Every experienced pilot who read it came to the same conclusion. This was not a combat assignment. It was a scheduled execution. You could not send one slow bomber over that island in daylight without a fighter escort and expect it to survive 20 minutes. The mathematics were simple and brutal. One American bomber against the Zeros of Bougainville equaled 0 survivors. Every qualified pilot turned it down. Command was stuck. They needed the photographs. They could not order a crew to fly a suicide mission. They were looking for volunteers who either didn't understand the odds or didn't care about them. That is when J. Zemer walked into the operations tent. Zemer was 34 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of the men flying combat in the Pacific. He had been educated at MIT. He was not a fool. He understood the mission profile better than most of the men who had turned it down. He understood that what made it survivable was not better odds, but a completely different approach to the aircraft itself. And Zimmer had spent the past several weeks quietly building exactly the weapon the mission required. To understand who Zimmer was, you need to understand who he was not. He was not the polished formation-flying order-following officer that the Army Air Force had a template for. He had a condition that made sleep nearly impossible for extended periods, which meant he spent his nights wandering the flight line with a flashlight looking at engines, studying maps, and gravitating toward the one area of the airfield where nobody else went after dark. The Boneyard. The Boneyard at the 7-mile drome outside Port Moresby, New Guinea, was where aircraft went when they were finished. Not destroyed in combat, not salvageable. Just done. The tropical heat accelerated the deterioration. The jungle crept toward the fence line. The aluminum skins of the broken machines faded in the sun. Mechanics visited to strip usable parts and left everything else to rot. In the middle of this mechanical graveyard sat a B-17 that even the scavengers walked around. Serial number 412666. Its tail number ended in 666. Which was enough reason for superstitious airmen to give it a wide berth. But the number was the least of its problems. The plane had arrived in the Pacific with a structural imbalance in the tail section that made it fly like a truck with a broken axle. It was sluggish, unresponsive, and slow to climb. Pilots who had tested it described it as wallowing through the air. Command had parked it in the boneyard and moved on. The official verdict was that it was useful only for spare parts. Zimmer looked at it and saw something different. He saw a platform. A heavy, stable, armored platform that nobody else wanted, which meant it was effectively his. He understood something that the experts evaluating the plane by standard metrics had missed. The plane's sluggishness was not a fatal flaw if you weren't trying to fly formation or outmaneuver a fighter. If you were trying to build a flying weapon system that could absorb punishment and keep shooting a heavy, stable airframe was an asset. He started working on it at night alone, at first with a flashlight and a set of tools. He cleaned the spark plugs on all 4 engines. He patched holes in the aluminum skin using scraps of metal from other wrecks. He tuned the engines by ear, adjusting fuel mixture and timing until the coughing resolved into a steady, deep roar. He treated the abandoned machine the way a mechanic treats a neglected classic car, not as a collection of broken parts, but as a system waiting to be brought back into balance. The other pilots noticed. They laughed. They asked him why he was wasting time on a lemon that would never fly. He ignored them, because Zimmer was not just repairing the plane. He was redesigning it. A standard B-17 carried 10 machine guns. Zimmer decided that was insufficient for a solo run over Bougainville. He and the crew he was assembling men recruited from the brig, from the dismissal lists, from the rosters of pilots and gunners and bombardiers that other crews had rejected, began a modification program that violated multiple regulations and would have caused the engineering corps to suffer collective cardiac arrest. They scavenged heavy .50 caliber machine guns from wrecked aircraft across the boneyard and began mounting them in positions that the original design had never intended. They cut new holes in the fuselage. They built custom mounts in the waist section, replacing standard single guns with twin-mounted .50 calibers. They added downward-firing guns to cover the belly the angle Japanese pilots habitually exploited. They transformed the interior of the bomber into a bristling, chaotic architecture of steel and ammunition belts. But the most significant modification was in the nose. The standard B-17 nose gun was a .30 caliber machine gun on a flexible mount operated by the bombardier. It was defensive, designed to discourage attacking fighters rather than destroy them. Japanese Zero pilots knew this. They were trained to attack B-17s head-on from 12 o'clock high diving straight at the cockpit glass because the nose armament was too light to stop a committed attack. It was the B-17's most exploited vulnerability. Zimmer fixed it by doing something no pilot was supposed to do. He mounted a fixed-point, 5.0 caliber machine gun to the cockpit floor, aimed forward through the nose glass, and wired a trigger to the control yoke. This meant that to shoot the gun, he did not call for a gunner. He aimed the entire aircraft. He turned the B-17 into the world's largest, slowest, most improbable fighter plane. The engineers would have cited the recoil stress on the airframe, the effect on center of gravity, the impossibility of aiming a 30-ton bomber with the precision required to hit a fast-moving fighter. Zimmer sat in the cockpit and sighted down the barrel and imagined a Zero coming at him head-on. He imagined the expression on the enemy pilot's face. He smiled. He brought in Joseph Sarnowski as his bombardier. Sarnowski was arguably the finest aerial gunnery instinct in the Pacific theater, a man whose accuracy was the stuff of squadron legend, and whose relationship with authority was the reason he was available. Sarnowski mounted an additional .50 caliber on a flexible mount in the nose position, turning the glass bubble that was supposed to be a navigator's office into a forward turret operated by two men who were genuinely looking for a fight. When they were finished, the plane carried 19 machine guns, nearly double the standard loadout. It sat low on its landing gear under the weight of the extra steel ammunition, full fuel tanks, and the heavy mapping cameras mounted in the belly. The other crews watched the preparation in silence. The jokes had stopped. This was no longer funny. This was a plane that looked like it wanted to kill something. On the morning of June 16, 1943, Zimmer ran through his pre-flight checklist, fired up the four engines, and pointed the nose north. The plane rolled down the runway, heavy and vibrating trees rushing toward them at the far end of the tarmac. For one suspended second, it looked like the weight would win, like the curse was real, like the boneyard would claim it one last time. Then the wheels left the ground. The broken plane climbed into the humid air above New Guinea, turned toward the Solomon Sea, and began the 400-mile journey to Bougainville. Inside the fuselage, a crew of misfits and cast-offs checked their guns. The cameras were loaded. The ammunition belts were seated. Every man knew what was waiting on the other side of the horizon. 17 Japanese Zero fighters were already being scrambled to intercept them. And in Part 2, what happens in that cockpit when the first Zero appears in the windshield will change everything you think you know about courage under fire. Because the most unbelievable moment of this story hasn't happened yet. Last time we left Captain J. Zimmer climbing away from the graveyard runway at Port Moresby in a plane the Army Air Force had condemned as scrap metal. He and his crew of misfits, renegades, and cast-offs had spent weeks transforming that dead machine into something no engineer had sanctioned and no manual described. 19 machine guns, a trigger wired to the pilot's control yoke, a bombardier named Sarnowski, who was arguably the best shot in the Pacific and the least interested in following orders. They had volunteered for a mission every rational pilot had refused a solo photographic run over the most heavily defended island in the Solomon chain. And now they were airborne climbing north over the Solomon Sea. 17 Japanese Zero fighters were already rising from the airfields below Bougainville to meet them. Here is a number that puts that in perspective. In every documented case prior to June 16, 1943, when a single unescorted B-17 was intercepted by more than 8 Zero fighters in daylight, the bomber did not return. The survival rate was 0. Zimmer was flying into odds that history said were unsurvivable, and the battle hadn't even started yet. This is Part 2, and this is where everything gets worse before it gets impossible. The approach to Bougainville took 40 minutes at cruise altitude. Inside the fuselage, the temperature at 25,000 feet had dropped below 0. The crew wore leather jackets and gloves, but the cold still found them working through the seams, numbing fingers that needed to stay on triggers. Zimmer held a steady heading, checking his compass every 30 seconds. He was thinking about the geometry of the run. To photograph the coastline properly, he needed to fly straight and level, no banking, no weaving, for a minimum of 20 uninterrupted minutes. Any deviation, and the photos would be useless. The mission wasted Sarnowski's fighting instincts and every stolen gunbolt and welded bracket amounting to nothing. The island appeared on the horizon as a dark green mass sitting on blue water. beautiful, peaceful from a distance. Then the tail gunner's voice came over the intercom flat and professional, the voice of a man who had already processed his fear and moved past it. Contacts. 6 o'clock low, climbing fast. Count is 7. Correction. 12. They're still coming up. Zimmer keyed his intercom. He told every gunner to call their sectors. He told Sarnowski to start the cameras. He did not alter course. He did not increase speed. He held the line. The final count from the tail position was 17 fighters. They had climbed in 2 distinct groups, which told Zimmer something important. These were not scrambled patrol planes reacting with surprise. This was a coordinated intercept. The Japanese controllers on the ground had tracked his approach on radar and organized a tactical response. The lead group was swinging wide and climbing above him, positioning for the classic 12 o'clock high attack. The second group was coming from the rear and below the angle that B-17 belly gunners found hardest to track. These pilots were professionals executing a rehearsed playbook. The playbook assumed the nose of the B-17 was soft. The lead zero rolled inverted at altitude and came down. The pilot built up speed in the dive, leveled out several hundred feet above Zimmer's altitude, and then pointed his nose directly at the cockpit glass. He was closing at a combined speed of roughly 500 miles per hour. He would have seen a slow, damaged-looking bomber plodding through clear sky. He would have seen the glass nose, the standard defensive position that his training told him was armed with a light gun that could not hurt him at range. He would have been thinking about the angle, the deflection, the precise moment to open fire with his 20mm cannon. He was not thinking about what was mounted to the cockpit floor of that bomber. He had no reason to. Zimmer watched the Zero through the windshield. He did not bank away. He used the rudder pedals to skid the heavy nose of the B-17 left then right, walking the crosshairs of the fixed gun toward the incoming fighter. The Zero grew in the glass, propeller disc visible, canopy catching light. Zimmer waited. He waited past the point where every instinct said to flinch. He squeezed the trigger on the yoke. The .50 caliber in the nose erupted. The recoil shook the cockpit floor. Heavy armor-piercing rounds, each one the size of a man's thumb, hit the Zero in the engine block. The fighter did not trail smoke and peel away. It came apart. 1 second it was a lethal machine in a killing dive. The next second it was a debris field tumbling past Zimmer's window in a rolling orange flash. The explosion was close enough that fragments rattled against the fuselage like gravel thrown at a window. Silence on the intercom. Then Sarnowski's voice. 2 o'clock. Coming fast. Sarnowski swung his flexible .50 caliber and caught the second Zero in a banking turn, walking tracers through the fuselage. The Japanese plane began trailing a thick rope of black smoke breaking off its attack. The first 20 seconds of contact had cost the Japanese 2 fighters and whatever operational confidence they carried into the intercept. They had never seen a B-17 fight like this. They regrouped. Then they attacked in earnest. The remaining 15 Zeros abandoned the textbook and swarmed. They came from the sides simultaneously, 3 at a time, overlapping attack angles to saturate the defensive fire. 20mm cannon shells began hitting the fuselage. The sound was not like the movies. It was not a clean bang. It was a tearing, cracking percussion that Zimmer felt through the seat frame as much as he heard it. Holes appeared in the aluminum skin the size of dinner plates. A cannon round detonated against the nose glass. The explosion blew Sarnowski backward off his gun. He hit the metal deck and did not move. Blood was visible on his stomach. Shrapnel had torn through the lower fuselage and found him. The wound was catastrophic. Everyone in the nose section understood within seconds that it was mortal. Then a second impact. A bullet punched through the cockpit floor and shattered Zimmer's left knee. Another tore through his wrist. His flight suit began absorbing blood. The pain was specific and enormous, but he registered it the way a surgeon registers an alarm, as information requiring immediate management, not a reason to stop. He wedged his broken leg against the rudder pedal, using dead weight to maintain trim. He kept both hands on the yoke. The cameras in the belly were still clicking. In the nose, Sarnowski moved. He did not stand. He crawled. He pulled himself across the blood-slicked deck, using his arms, dragged his body up against the gun mount and gripped the handles. He looked out through the shattered opening where the nose glass used to be. Cold air at 25,000 feet was roaring through the gap at hurricane force. His hands were shaking, but they found the trigger. A Zero, seeing the nose position, apparently inactive, made a slow, arrogant pass across the front of the bomber, presenting its belly. It was the last mistake that pilot ever made. Sarnowski fired. He walked the tracers by instinct because his eyes were losing focus, but the instinct was perfect. The rounds hit the Zero's fuel tank. The Japanese plane vanished in a flash that lit the inside of the nose compartment orange. Sarnowski slumped against the bulkhead. He kept his hand on the trigger. The battle ran for 40 minutes. In an air engagement, a dogfight typically lasts between 30 and 90 seconds. 40 minutes of sustained combat at altitude in a damaged aircraft, with a pilot bleeding from 2 wounds and a bombardier dying at his station, has no historical parallel in the Pacific theater. The waist gunners worked through their ammunition in rotations, swapping overheated barrels with spares, while spent brass casings rolled across the floor in a continuous metallic tide. The tail gunner, working alone in his isolated position, methodically dismantled 3 separate attack runs, shooting the propeller off 1-0 with a sustained burst that the pilot would later describe as the calmest shooting he had ever witnessed. By minute 30, the Japanese had lost 5 confirmed fighters. Others were damaged and had broken off. The squadron that had launched with the confidence of overwhelming numbers was now operating with caution, pulling their attack runs shorter, spending more time evaluating before committing. The Porcupine had drawn blood 17 times and was still in the sky. At minute 38, Zimmer's oxygen system failed. At 25,000 feet without supplemental oxygen, a man loses consciousness within minutes. He pushed the nose down into a shallow, high-speed descent, trading altitude for breathable air, eating up the distance between himself and the cloud cover below. The remaining Zeros followed for another pass, then broke off. Their fuel was critical. Their ammunition was low, and the American bomber they had been sent to destroy was still inexplicably flying. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Zimmer had ever heard. He leveled off at 10,000 feet. He looked at his instrument panel. Half the gauges were shattered or non-functional. The hydraulic system was gone, which meant no brakes, no flaps, no landing gear, retraction capability. The radio was dead. One engine was running rough. The control cables to the rudder had been hit and were holding by a thread count he did not want to calculate. Sarnowski was unconscious in the nose. Most of the crew had wounds of varying severity. Port Moresby was 400 miles south. Zimmer pointed the nose south and flew. He kept himself conscious through the return by pain and stubbornness in approximately equal measure. He hallucinated. He saw Zeros in cloud formations. He thought the ocean was the runway. The navigator himself, wounded, kept appearing at his shoulder with course corrections. Zimmer followed them. When the 7-mile drome appeared through the windshield, Zimmer fired a red flare through the broken nose. Ground crews cleared the runway. Fire trucks moved into position. He came in hot too fast with no flaps to bleed speed and no brakes to stop. The main wheels hit the tarmac. The plane bounced, settled, and rolled. It rolled past the normal stopping point. It rolled into the dirt at the runway's end and ground to a stop in a cloud of red dust. The engines died one by one. The medics who pulled Sarnowski from the nose found him still gripping his gun. He died shortly after reaching the hospital tent. The cameras in the belly of the plane were intact. Every frame of film had been exposed. And in Part 3, when the intelligence officers developed those photographs in the darkroom and held the negatives up to the light, what they saw would change the entire Pacific strategy. Because the mission was over, but the consequences were just beginning. And someone in Washington was about to make a decision based on those photos that would send thousands of men to a beach that Zimmer and Sarnowski had just mapped with their blood. The real story is only halfway told. 2 parts ago, a pilot nobody wanted climbed into a bomber, Nobody wanted and flew it toward an island that the entire United States Army Air Force had agreed was a death sentence. Jay Zemer and his crew of misfits fought off 17 Japanese Zero fighters for 40 minutes over Bougainville, completed the photographic run while bleeding from multiple wounds, and brought the plane home in pieces. Bombardier Joseph Sarnowski died at his gun. The cameras survived intact. When the intelligence officers pulled the film from the wreckage and rushed it to the darkroom, they didn't know what they had yet. They knew a crew had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. They didn't know the photographs were perfect. They didn't know that the images on that film would trigger a chain of military decisions that would send 50,000 American Marines toward a beach they could now map in precise detail. They didn't know that the Japanese within 72 hours would learn what had happened over their island. And they didn't know what the Japanese would do about it. Here is the number that matters. Before June 16, 1943, the American forces planning the Bougainville campaign estimated potential first-wave casualties at between 8,000 and 12,000 men, based on the incomplete intelligence available. After the Zemer photographs were analyzed, that estimate dropped by 60%. The photos revealed hidden gun emplacements that would have massacred landing craft. They revealed reef systems that would have grounded half the invasion fleet. They revealed the precise depth and layout of Empress Augusta Bay, the landing site that would be chosen for the November assault. Those photographs didn't just justify the mission. They changed the arithmetic of the entire campaign. But this is not just a story about photographs. The Japanese intelligence network in the Solomon Islands was efficient. Within 3 days of the June 16th intercept, senior officers at Rabaul, the main Japanese command hub in the region, had received a full report. One American B-17 unescorted had penetrated the Bougainville air defense perimeter in broad daylight, survived engagement with 17 Zero fighters from the 251st Naval Air Group, completed a photographic run of the coast, and returned to base. The 251st had lost 5 aircraft confirmed destroyed and 3 more with severe damage. The American bomber had landed with 187 bullet holes in the fuselage. The reaction at Rabaul was not panic. It was professional alarm of the highest order. Commander Takahide Ioi, the officer responsible for the 251st Air Group's operational performance, convened an emergency review. His pilots had executed the standard intercept playbook against a single slow bomber and absorbed catastrophic losses. The after-action reports described a B-17 armed with fixed forward-firing heavy machine guns that had destroyed the lead attacker before a single Japanese bullet found the fuselage. The reports described a nose gunner who continued firing after sustaining a mortal wound. The reports described 40 minutes of sustained combat against a crew that refused to behave like a crew that was losing. Ioi ordered immediate changes. Frontal attacks against B-17S were suspended pending tactical review. New approach vectors were developed that prioritized the tail and the belly at oblique angles, attempting to saturate the modified gunner positions from directions the fixed nose gun could not address. Zero pilots were briefed that the standard assumptions about American bomber vulnerability no longer applied. The briefing used the Zemer engagement as a case study. The conclusion was blunt. These Americans had built something new. Find its weakness or stop attacking it directly. The Japanese also did something that American intelligence would not confirm for several weeks. They began modifying their own aircraft. Specifically, they started arming a number of Zeros with additional forward-firing armament and increasing the armor protection around the engine and fuel systems, the exact components that Zemer's fixed nose gun had destroyed in the lead fighter. The irony was significant. One unauthorized modification by a sleep-deprived American pilot in a boneyard had triggered a counter-development program inside the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service. But this is where the story gets complicated. Back at Port Moresby, while Zemer was unconscious in the hospital and Sarnowski was being prepared for burial, the mission report was working its way up the chain of command. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, read the after-action document. He read about the 19 guns. He read about the fixed forward-firing weapon. He read the list of unauthorized modifications that a pilot under his command had made to a military aircraft without authorization, using scavenged parts, without engineering review, in direct violation of maintenance protocols that existed for documented safety reasons. Kenny had a decision to make. He could acknowledge the violations and open a formal review, which would require him to explain why one of his pilots had been wandering around a boneyard at midnight, welding guns to a condemned bomber. Or he could read the casualty report, look at the photographs that were already being transmitted to Pacific Command headquarters, and make a different kind of decision. He read the photographs again. He picked up his pen. He began writing the Medal of Honor citations for Captain J. Zemer and Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski. It was the first time in the Pacific Theater that two men from the same aircraft had been recommended for the nation's highest military decoration for the same mission. The citations described in the measured language of official military commendation acts of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The engineers' objections were never filed, but the objections from the Japanese were filed in blood. November 1st, 1943. Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. 0 hour was 07:26 local time. 14,000 United States Marines from the 3rd Marine Division went over the sides of their transports and into the landing craft. The bay was calm. The jungle above the beach was dense and green and silent in the early morning light. The silence was the silence of prepared defenses waiting for a target to enter range. Except the defenses weren't where the Japanese had placed them to be most effective. The Marines knew where the bunkers were. They knew which sections of beach were covered by interlocking fields of fire and which had gaps. They knew the reef lines. They knew the depth at the landing zones. They knew all of this because a man with a shattered knee had held a bomber steady for 20 minutes over this exact coastline while bleeding into his flight suit, and because another man had kept a machine gun pointed at the sky while his body was shutting down. The landing was not clean. No amphibious assault is clean. The Japanese resistance was fierce, and the jungle fighting that followed the beach landing lasted for months. But the catastrophic first-wave casualties that military planners had feared, the 12,000 men projected to die on the beaches based on pre-Zemer intelligence, did not materialize. The landing force found the gun emplacements where the photographs said they would be. They avoided the reef systems that would have destroyed landing craft. They concentrated their force at the gaps in the Japanese defensive line that only the photographs had revealed. The beach was taken. In the first 4 hours of the assault, American casualties were approximately a quarter of the pre-mission projections. The difference, the lives that existed in the space between what the planners had feared and what actually happened, was a direct function of the quality of the intelligence. And the intelligence was a direct function of 20 minutes of steady flying by a pilot who had no business being in that cockpit. The Japanese defensive commanders on Bougainville had prepared for an enemy that didn't know their positions. The enemy knew their positions. Every bunker the Japanese had spent months concealing in the jungle had been photographed from 25,000 feet, with enough resolution for intelligence analysts to calculate the caliber of the weapons inside. The tactical advantage that comes from surprise worked in reverse. The Americans weren't surprised. The Japanese were surprised that the Americans weren't surprised. Within 48 hours of the landing, the Japanese air response from Rabaul came in waves. Over the following 2 weeks, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched multiple airstrikes against the beachhead and the American naval forces supporting it. The strikes were met by American fighters operating from the intelligence baseline that the Zemer photographs had established. The Japanese lost over 100 aircraft in the air campaign over Bougainville between November and December 1943. American air losses during the same period were 32 planes. The ratio had inverted. The hunters were being hunted. General Kenny's after-action analysis of the Bougainville campaign, submitted to Pacific Command in January 1944, identified the June 16 photographic mission as the single most operationally significant intelligence-gathering operation of the Solomon Islands campaign. The phrase he used was that the photographs had effectively shortened the Bougainville campaign by an estimated 6 to 8 weeks and prevented casualties that the pre-mission projections suggested would have been prohibitive. That is the language of a general writing for the record. Strip the bureaucratic phrasing away, and what it means is this. Men were alive in December 1943 who would not have been alive if Ziemer had listened to the operations officer who tried to talk him out of volunteering. The Medal of Honor ceremonies took place at separate times because the recipients were in different conditions. Sarnowski's was posthumous, presented to his family. Ziemer received his in a hospital bed, still in a cast, still in the process of rebuilding the leg that a Japanese bullet had destroyed at 25,000 feet. He was thin. He looked like a man who had spent months fighting his own body instead of the enemy, which was exactly what he had been doing. When the officer placed the ribbon around his neck, Ziemer looked at it for a long moment. Then he said something that the attending personnel remembered afterward. He said the medal belonged to his bombardier. He said Sarnowski had held the gun while he should have been dying, and that without him the photographs never get taken and the plane never gets home. He said he was accepting the decoration on behalf of a dead man who had done something he was not able to do himself. Then he asked when he could get back to flying. But here is what most accounts of this story leave out. What happened to Jay Ziemer after the hospital is a story in itself. What happened to the crew? What happened to the plane? And what the legacy of one unauthorized modification in a Pacific boneyard eventually meant for the way American heavy bombers were armed and flown and thought about for the rest of the war. Because the engineers who would have screamed about the fixed nose gun eventually got quiet. And then they got curious. And then they started asking whether Ziemer's improvised solution pointed towards something that the official design process had been too conservative to discover on its own. The answer to that question is in Part 4. And so is the part of this story that the history books treat as a footnote, but which is actually the whole point. Because what Ziemer built in that boneyard was not just a weapon. It was a proof of concept for something much larger than one mission over one island. And the man who proved it spent the rest of his life in modest obscurity on a porch in Maine, keeping a Medal of Honor in a drawer. That story still needs to be told. 4 parts ago, we started with a condemned bomber in a graveyard and a pilot who couldn't sleep. We watched Jay Ziemer build something from nothing, assemble a crew from the men nobody else wanted, volunteer for a mission nobody else would take, and fly into the teeth of 17 Japanese fighters over one of the most heavily defended islands in the Pacific. We watched him hold the plane steady while bleeding to death. We watched Joseph Sarnowski keep his hands on the gun while his body was shutting down. We watched the photographs come back perfect, the Marines land on a beach they could finally see, and the casualty projections collapse by 60% because 2 men refused to quit. At the moment, every rational calculation said to quit. But here is the question that the history books answer in a single paragraph and then move past. What happened to Jay Ziemer when it was over? What does a man do with the rest of his life after he has already lived the most significant 20 minutes of it at 25,000 feet with a shattered knee and a dead friend in the nose? And what does the thing he built in that boneyard mean now, 80 years later, to people who will never know his name? Because this story has one more chapter, and it is the one that matters most. Ziemer spent 4 months in the hospital at Port Moresby and then in Australia. The surgeons who worked on his leg told him the damage was extensive enough that walking without assistance was optimistic. Walking without pain was probably not achievable. Flying again was, in their professional opinion, not a realistic expectation. Ziemer listened to this assessment with the same expression he had used when the operations officer told him his plane was junk. He nodded. He thanked them. Then he began the process of proving them wrong. He was transferred stateside in late 1943. The Medal of Honor ceremony was held in January 1944 at a military hospital, Ziemer still in a cast, still visibly diminished from the blood loss and the surgery and the months of recovery. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, placed the ribbon around his neck personally. The room was full of officers and photographers. Ziemer looked at the medal and then looked away. The people in the room who knew him, the men from the squadron who had made the trip, understood what that expression meant. He was thinking about Sarnowski. He was thinking about a bombardier who had died holding a gun. He had no physical strength left to hold, because the mission wasn't finished yet, and Sarnowski had decided that the mission mattered more than his own survival. Sarnowski's Medal of Honor was presented to his family in Pennsylvania. He was 29 years old when he died. He had been the best shot in the Pacific, and the worst-behaved officer in his squadron, and the most loyal man J. Ziemer ever flew with. Ziemer did learn to walk again. He did it the way he did everything, by ignoring the people who told him the timeline was unrealistic and working past the point where a reasonable man would have stopped. He returned to limited flight status in 1944, though the Army Air Force, with a careful eye on its most decorated active pilot, did not send him back to the Pacific. The war ended in August 1945. Ziemer was 36 years old. He had survived a fight that had given him a shattered knee, a damaged wrist, severe blood loss, and a weight of command that a man carries differently than a physical wound. He went home. What he did not do was become famous. He did not write a memoir. He did not go on speaking tours. He did not become the kind of decorated veteran whose story gets turned into a film during the wave of post-war patriotism that swept through American popular culture in the late 1940s. He went back to work in aviation quietly, in roles that used his engineering instincts and his mechanical knowledge without requiring him to be a public figure. He eventually settled in Maine, married, raised a family, and built a life that looked from the outside like the life of a man who had never done anything more remarkable than tend a garden and watch the seasons change over the Atlantic coast. The Medal of Honor stayed in a drawer. He gave occasional interviews when historians tracked him down. He was unfailingly gracious and precise in those conversations, accurate about dates and technical details, careful to redirect credit toward his crew at every opportunity. He mentioned Sarnowski in every interview. He never mentioned himself without mentioning Sarnowski first. This was not false modesty. It was the honest accounting of a man who understood exactly how the mission had actually worked, which guns had been responsible for which outcomes, and who had been the essential element at the essential moment. He passed away on March 22, 2007, at the age of 88. He was at the time of his death the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the United States Army Air Forces of World War II. When he died, the final living connection to the Army Air Force's highest traditions of valor closed. He had outlasted every other man who had earned that decoration in that service by years. But the thing he built did not die with him. The fixed forward-firing armament that Ziemer welded to his cockpit floor in violation of every regulation the Army Air Forces had written on the subject was by the official engineering doctrine of 1943, a dangerous improvisation with no future in serious aviation. Within 18 months of the Bougainville mission, it was a standard modification being evaluated by the engineering corps that had originally called it impossible. The concept of using a heavy bomber's own mass and directional control as an aiming mechanism for fixed weapons. The idea that a pilot could function simultaneously as a gunner by pointing the aircraft rather than the gun did not originate with Ziemer. But he proved it in the most demanding operational conditions imaginable, and proof has a way of ending theoretical arguments. The B-29 Superfortress, which became the primary American strategic bomber for the remainder of the Pacific War, incorporated forward-firing defensive armament as a standard design element that reflected lessons learned from the Pacific theater engagements of 1943 and 1944. The specific influence of the Ziemer modifications on the B-29's design specifications is not cleanly documented in the official record, partly because the official record had never formally acknowledged the Ziemer modifications as legitimate in the first place. But the engineers who designed the B-29's defensive armament system had read the after-action reports. They had seen the engagement data. They knew what a plane with a fixed nose gun had done to 17 Zeros over Bougainville. The principle carried forward. In the Korean War, American bomber crews operating in contested airspace used defensive armament configurations that reflected the tactical lessons of the Pacific Theater engagements. In Vietnam, the AC-130 gunship, one of the most effective close air support platforms ever built, operated on a principle that Zimmer would have recognized immediately. The aircraft itself becomes the aiming mechanism. You point the plane at the target. The fixed weapons do the rest. It is the boneyard modification scaled up and formalized and given a budget and a manual, but the core insight is identical. A stable heavy aircraft committed to a firing solution by the pilot, rather than by a gunner operating independently, is more accurate, more lethal, and more survivable in certain combat environments than a conventionally armed platform. The AC-130 is still flying today. The principle is still working. But the largest lesson of this story is not about guns or cameras or the weight distribution of a modified B-17 tail section. It is about something that military institutions and large organizations of every kind consistently struggle to learn and consistently forget between the moments when they need it most. The lesson is about where good ideas actually come from. The Army Air Forces in 1943 had engineering departments. It had design bureaus. It had committees and review boards and technical oversight processes built to ensure that modifications to combat aircraft were evaluated, tested, approved, and implemented in a systematic and documented manner. These systems existed for legitimate reasons. Unreviewed modifications to aircraft can be fatal. The people who built those oversight systems were not fools. They were applying hard-won knowledge about what happens when improvisation goes wrong at altitude. But those same systems had condemned a functional aircraft to a boneyard because it didn't meet standard performance metrics. Those same systems had declared a solo photographic run over Bougainville impossible and stopped looking for a way to make it possible. Those same systems had no mechanism for a pilot with insomnia and a flashlight to walk through a graveyard of broken machines at midnight and see something that the institutional evaluation process had missed. Zimmer was not smarter than the engineers. He was outside the institutional framework that told the engineers what questions were worth asking. He was asking a different question. Not can this plane meet the performance standard, but what can this plane do that nothing else can? Not is this modification approved, but does it solve the problem? Not is this mission survivable by conventional means, but what would it take to make it survivable by unconventional ones? History is full of people who were asking the wrong questions by institutional standards and the right questions by operational ones. The Norden bomb sight, which revolutionized precision bombing, was developed by a Dutch immigrant engineer working outside the established naval procurement process. The proximity fuse, which transformed anti-aircraft effectiveness in the Pacific, was developed by a small civilian research group that military bureaucracies had initially declined to fund. The Jeep, the M1 Garand radar penicillin on the battlefield. The list of innovations that were initially rejected, delayed, ignored, or actively opposed by the institutions that eventually deployed them is long enough to be its own history. The institutions were not wrong to have standards. The innovators were not wrong to push past them. The tension between those two impulses is where progress actually lives. Now here is the detail that almost no account of this story includes. The plane itself, the Boneyard bomber with serial number 412666, was towed back to the scrapyard at Port Moresby after the June 16th mission and assessed for repair. The structural damage to the main wing spar, the hydraulic system, the control surfaces, and the fuselage framing was evaluated by the same maintenance crews who had originally called the aircraft a total loss. Their conclusion was the same as it had been before Zimmer found it. The plane was beyond economical repair. It was stripped of any remaining usable components and left to deteriorate in the tropical heat. But before the stripping began, the mechanics counted the bullet holes one more time. The official final count was 187 bullet holes and 5 cannon shell penetrations. Then one of the crew chiefs, a man whose name does not appear in the official record, but whose action is documented in a post-war account by one of the surviving crew members, removed the fixed gun mount from the cockpit floor. The improvised mount that Ziemer had bolted to the deck with scavenged hardware and connected to a trigger on the control yoke. The thing that had killed the lead Zero before the Japanese squadron understood what they were flying into. He kept it. He carried it with him through the remainder of his Pacific deployment and brought it home to the United States when the war ended. What happened to it after that is unknown. It was never donated to a museum. It was never cataloged. It exists somewhere in the world in a garage or an attic or a storage unit, unlabeled and unrecognized, a piece of welded steel that was present at one of the most extraordinary moments of air combat in the history of aviation and has no idea what it is. This is what J. Ziemer left behind. A principle that is still flying. A beach that was taken at a fraction of the predicted cost. A drawer in a house in Maine that held a medal and a story that he never pushed the world to hear. A crew of misfits who turned out to be exactly the right men for exactly the right moment. And a piece of improvised steel somewhere that nobody has found yet. From a condemned plane in a boneyard flown by a pilot the institution had run out of uses for, came photographs that saved thousands of lives, and a lesson about innovation that military engineers are still applying 8 decades later. J. Ziemer proved that the most dangerous thing in any conflict is not the most advanced weapon on the field. It is the person who looks at what has been written off and refuses to agree. The experts counted the holes and saw a wreck. Ziemer counted the guns and saw a weapon. That difference, that single stubborn refusal to accept the institutional verdict, is the whole story. And the whole story is worth every minute you spent with it. If this one moved, you share it. Tell us in the comments which other forgotten innovators deserve this treatment. And subscribe, because we are just getting started on the stories that history put in a drawer and forgot to tell. The ones that change how you see everything else. Some planes are only cursed until the right pilot climbs in.